If you're looking down from above, you can see that there's a white pattern on the space, but when you're down on ground level, you don't really pick that up. That's not really important. Effectively, the space is just a series of pavers. The quality of this space comes from the definition, the quality of the buildings around the edge, and how they interact with the space. But not only that, it's actually where this space is in relation to the rest of the town and what's going on in the rest of the town. It's the context of where it is that's important. And another example here is the central square in Siena in Italy. And again, the slightly different paving pattern, but again, it's the quality of the buildings and the interaction of the buildings with the space that makes this such a stunning place. So what we've got is we've got buildings and spaces which are largely designed. And I think it's fair to say that architects largely design the buildings, and landscape architects get pretty much most of the spaces to design. And of course, there are other people involved as well, engineers and utility, stormwater. But we have to consider how the people inhabit these spaces, and so we end up having to understand human behavior as well. There's a sort of social element to this as well. But I think what frustrates me most is when urban design is considered just to be another one of those people, another one that's just added to the list of people who need to be involved with the project. Urban design, I consider, is not just another discipline. The actual process of thinking about how all those elements come together, all those different components, how they all come together, is what urban design is. So we're all responsible for urban design. It's not a separate profession in its own right. It's more the profession considering how all those things come together. And I like to compare this to an analogy of building a car. If you break a car down, you'd see, hundreds, maybe thousands of different components. Each one the responsibility of a designer. But when you're building a car, you don't just go away and let a whole host of designers design different components and then hope that when you stick them all together, you end up with a decent car. Somebody has to take the responsibility of ensuring that there's an overall design in which you're working to. And if you do that, then you can end up with some quite good results. But if you just let the designers go off, then one or two of them might have their own ideas and do something a little bit different, and you could bring them together and come up with something slightly unexpected, which might still work for those people who like large wheels, but it's slightly different, or you could end up with something that perhaps doesn't work in certain circumstances. And then what's happened over the last 50 years particularly is that our spaces used to consist largely of those sorts of elements, as I say, under the responsibility of landscape architects. But then something came along, the car came along, and we ended up with different use of our spaces that largely sort of dominated by cars. And the engineers got involved. I'm not going to bash the engineers because that's an easy one to do, but it is symptomatic of what happened over the last 50 years. And the result has been a slight imbalance. Buildings still reasonably important. The quality of space has sort of been neglected to a degree, and highway infrastructure has started to dominate our places. And we end up with lots of places, particularly within New Zealand, that start to look like this. And like this. This could be anywhere. In fact, most of our towns and cities have got many, many streets that look like this. Car parks and retailing areas like this, and then even our housing is affected by accommodating the car. Now, I'm not totally against the car. I know urban designers can be considered to be just anti-car, but I think it's having the car in its right place and having it at the right amount. And I think what we've seen over the last 50 years, it's just begun to dominate, and I think only in the last 10 years, maybe even in the last 2 or 3 years, we're starting to realise that fact, but I don't know whether we're doing anything about it. I love this picture. It's a classic picture. This is of Houston a few years ago in the States. And I think it's fair to say that the towns and cities in the States that have tried to accommodate the car, building more and more freeways, are the least healthy and attractive places to live, although one would have to question about the word attractive because they are growing rapidly. But attractive, I use the word attractive there in the sense of meeting those challenges, quality of life challenges that I talked about earlier. And there's some cities there that we know are trying to do that. And if you compare that to some of those cities that have made a deliberate stance, a different stance, going down the public transport route, and these are the cities that are generally regarded as having the better quality of life in the States. Can you read that? It's a bit small. Another thing that urban designers get accused of is that it's about making places just look good, and that it's about trying to provide places with as many coffee shops as possible. And I think if a place is working well, it becomes popular. And if it's popular, the coffee shops will want to be there. So We're not attempting to build places for lots of coffee shops, but if you're building a place right, then I think inevitably sometimes you get lots of coffee shops going there. There's been some good work in New Zealand, but particularly around the world, and we also understand now that there is great value in decent urban design, economic value. If you want the cold-hearted facts, it does actually make you money, and I think there's a number of studies, as I say, that sort of show that now. And I think if you look at places like Copenhagen, despite the climatic difficulties that Copenhagen's faced with, their efforts at urban design on street life has just resulted in an amazing public realm. And the city benefits from that as a whole. So making places, urban design or urban planning, whatever you want to call this, it's actually about making places that are safer and creating a sense of pride. And if you've got a neighbourhood or a community that's actually proud of where it lives, then they're more likely to look after it, and they're more likely to hang around longer as well, which gives a little bit more permanence to a place rather than a place where people are moving through all the time. More enjoyable, it's fairly obvious, and economically prosperous. I've talked about that already. But also places, the quality of our places, the nature of our built environment really does affect our lifestyle, and I think this is starting to be an emerging trend. Some good work a guy out of Australia called Mike Cullen is doing on this, and also some work in New Zealand I think is just starting to touch on this. It's about obesity, and I think this is a problem that is getting, you know, increasingly and dangerously so in New Zealand. You can look at the levels of obesity there, and New Zealand has got a problem. Really has. And then if you look at Germany and Italy on there, much less of a problem of obesity, even though all those nations all consume similar amounts of calories. And it's not just about car ownership either. As I say, Italy and Germany are quite high up on that list, up there with New Zealand. I think it's largely to do with how we've actually got our built environment, planned our built environment, particularly around retail. And I think that's just speaks for itself, that statistic. New Zealand not included there in Mike Cullen's work, but you can see the correlation between shopping centre floor space in sort of shopping malls compared to the obesity rates. And I think part of the problem is around the food court, that once upon a time where our city square, our city plazas and stuff were the centre of the community where people met and exchanged goods and social place, our food court has become that now, and our food court sells a particular type of food, and particularly affecting our obesity and fat levels. As well as, and it's not just about the food, of course, it's about how we actually get to our shopping malls. Generally, you go by car, short walking, not so much outside space. And I think some studies in the UK are showing that you look at the amount that we've actually walked over the last 20 years has fallen 110 kilometres per year, whilst at the same time car miles has been going up. And lots of studies are showing how those people who use public transport, because of the walking involved to public transport, far less likely to be overweight, fat or obese. And as I say, I think that's a huge issue for New Zealand. Some of the statistics coming out of the UK on this, some of the costs of that's a huge cost to this country. It's not a matter of just saying, well, if people want to be overweight, then that's fine. This is a huge cost to the country. But we sort of separate our health costs from our sort of transport and public transport infrastructure costs, not realising that one is actually affecting the other. If we can get people walking and cycling more and using public transport more, then our health costs go down, and that is affecting us all. So just going back to the list about making places, it's also about making places that are more adaptable and resilient to change, so that we don't have to keep starting again every time we want to, the market changes. Less harmful on the environment. I think this goes without saying, we're all aware of sustainability in the sort of energy, sort of green buildings sense. But I think this whole list is actually about what a sustainable place is. We talk about sort of green buildings and we sort of focus very much on energy and pollution and recyclable materials and stuff like that. But a truly sustainable place is a place that actually encompasses all those things. So sustainability and urban design I actually see as being actually after the same goal. We sometimes get specialists on both subjects, but we're actually after the same goal.